And so all these things sort of culminated in wanting to move back home in my territory and wanting to make, and really questioning, well, why can't I make space for art here, you know, in the rural, on reserve, you know, those spaces that's not New York and Paris, right? These ways in which we still locate like the center of kind of cosmopolitan art. And I have big questions about that. What does that mean? Who does that leave out when we kind of adhere to those expectations? For me, the Bush Gallery project was as much about being in place as well as questioning those ideas. And so I always thought of it as like you can kind of make your own Bush Gallery space wherever. And I didn't think I was doing anything totally new, just building on the ways in which, you know, people still harvest materials and make baskets and do things that are with the land. You know, if I really think through Secwépemc aesthetics and ideas that I've learned, I realized that the only kind of concept of gallery would be the land. And I'll just add this, that recently I had a chance to translate this manifesto we first wrote for Bush Gallery. You know, we used a number of kind of art terms and ideas in there. And I worked with Elder Flora Sampson and language instructor Janice Dick-Billy to translate what we wrote into Secwépemc. So into my language and into the language of the land here. And it was really interesting to get around these ideas. And we were translating just the idea of Bush Gallery. And it's an opportunity for me as well to kind of make space for resurgence in my work. You know, we have to all negotiate space and time and money, right? And so I just said, this is what I'm going to do. This is where I'm going to make space because these are things that I believe in.
Oh, thank you so much. And I want to immediately ask you questions about the Bush Manifesto, but I'm going to hold it. I'm going to say it out loud and hold it and start with a broader question and then move toward the more micro questions that are animating my thinking since I had the opportunity to read everything that you've offered to us for this conversation. And, you know, my question is, you know, you think out loud about the categories of pedagogy and field and land-based practice and art and aesthetics and feminism. And I was wondering, could you tell us in the context of this conversation in some of the ways that those terms, categories, modes of political being relate to you and your work?
Yeah, well, part of that translating, I'll get back to the manifesto quickly, just because part of translating it was translating the word feminism, because we write in the manifesto, Bush Gallery is feminist. And, you know, because I start from this place as a mother, as wanting to make space, you know, within the kind of push and pulls of the domestic as well. And so I tried to translate this idea of feminism, which was an interesting one to think about. And we came up with like chachat nochoch, which is a kind of like, it's kind of like an importance and a strength and a sacredness for women at Bush Gallery. You know, those are just deeply intertwined for me, the importance of and the space of feminism. You know, I'll say that not without a critique of feminism, right? In terms of the ways in which it didn't, in the earlier stages, kind of make enough space for Indigenous, Black, people of color within those practices. But it's still something I think is really important that allows us to question the kind of impacts of patriarchy and colonialism within our communities. So,
well, you took the conversation kind of exactly to the place that I think my next question would have taken it, because I was going to comment on how much joy and hope there is in the way you talk about Bush Gallery and your relationship to the land. But of course, there's narrative running underneath about what is happening to the land. You know, there's a huge protest at Fairy Creek on Vancouver Island, which is sort of really bringing into focus how complex this situation is around the land, because there are lots of people protesting the logging of old growth forests, but in so doing, they're questioning the rights of the Indigenous community whose territory that growth of trees is on to make a living from logging those trees. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you balance the hopefulness and joy of your relationship to the land with all of these things that are threatening your territory and all Indigenous territories.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I always struggle with like not doing enough And then I have to go like, okay, but I'm doing something and there are a lot of people doing nothing. So, you have to kind of balance that all out at times, because I don't feel like it could ever do enough. There's so many pressures, and has been since the onset of settler colonialism. We hear about things in the news, or hopefully we do, about the ongoing Secwépemc protest against the Canada-owned TMX pipeline. And those are really serious, and I contribute in ways that I can to those. But I also want to acknowledge all the people that are doing the really difficult frontline work, and that I think at times we only can do in bursts because it's really challenging work. So, their work on front lines as warriors is so important, but they need people behind that to support, so fundraisers, like building economies locally, speaking out, those are all things I hope that I'm contributing to do, as well as language resurgence and knowing the land and practicing harvest and stuff on the land. Those are subtler, more ongoing way, completely subversive activities, because if you read through like Secwépemc histories, that's what we've been fighting for 150 years, is being fenced out of our territories. And that fight comes from our love and the joy that brings, right? And so I think the only way I can kind of be sustained in some of that work is to have those experiences. I also think about futurity, in that even though this is a small piece of land that is impacted, it is and can be a future, and is and can be abundance.